Well, welcome to the 2021 crop management conferences. And today we're going to talk about how crop management might change as yields change over the next 50 years. If you've already looked at the unit I did on climate change and crop yields, we're going to start out with that, but then talk about sort of practical aspects of these changes and whether or not our management is going to have to change drastically over the years to keep our yields moving upward. I can tell you right away that the answer is probably not really, but or not by very much. But we'll look at that today on this unit. So in our look at climate change and crops, we concluded that although yield changes over the next 50 years are uncertain, it's likely that yields will continue to rise even if the weather warms in coming decades. And this is in Illinois. Here we will consider management of corn and soybeans and how it has changed as yields have increased in recent decades, and also how management might need to change to bring out the yield potential of crops as we move forward in the 21st century or the last 80 years of the 21st century. The corn model says that our yields have gone up in the last 40 years by 2.2 bushels per acre per year. And if we project that out to 2075, that's at about 300 and I believe 312 bushels by 2025. With the medium warming, and this goes back to the models that we used looking at crop models and climate or warming due to higher carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This moderate level RPC 4.5 shows a little bit lower rate of yield increase, but still up to about 265 or so by 2075. And the stronger warming that's likely to happen if we don't really bring diminished greenhouse gas emissions, or if they continue to go up, shows that rate per year dropping to 1.3 bushels per acre per year. And we would only at that level be at about 240 by 2075. Well, the first question, do we have the genetics to support 300 bushel corn yields by 2075? And I think the answer is a resounding yes. Genetic potential is there. But this is going to, we can't just say we've gotten these yields. And these data are from our variety trial program at the university in crop sciences. And I took the best site over the last 13 or 14, well, 23 or 24 years. I took the best location of those and averaged the yields of the top 10 hybrids in the trial. And you can see that's been going up over that period of time, about 2.5 bushels per acre per year. And at that rate, we'll be at 289. We are at 289 in 2020. And by 2075, that line reaches 429 bushels per acre. Well, I don't think that we're going to be routinely harvesting 429 bushels per acre, but we certainly have the potential to do that, the genetic potential, but it takes the right soils and management to make that happen. But the answer to the genetic question is probably without too much difficulty, we're going to be there. And our expectation is that continued genetic improvement is not only going to bring up the potential, but it's going to continue to make crops better at extracting the water and nutrients that they need to produce high yields. So I think we're going to see progress in both of those. The soybean model, equivalent to what I showed you with corn, shows us that we would be at about 88 bushels per acre if by 2075, if we continue current trend line over the last 40 years. So we're at 56.2 today, and we'd be at 88. With the medium warming or the higher line here, we'd be at about 79 bushels by 2075. And with the greater degree of warming, we'd be at about 76 bushels. So again, those aren't scary high numbers. They don't show what some people have been talking about, though, and that is lower yields in 50 years from now than we're having today. What about that same genetic question with soybean? Well, I answered it, or tried to, in the same way. Took our best variety trial in central Illinois each year through 2020, and that's showing an increase in yield of about a little over 1 bushel per acre per year. And I'll just call this one genetic potential, even though it's the average of the top 10 varieties. If we took the top 2 or something, it would be even higher than this. But I think it's trying to look at this in a realistic way. The trend line yield today is 92 bushels per acre per year. That's this one from these trials. And that reaches 149 by 2075. Again, will we be there? Probably not, but we're certainly going to have increased genetic potential and certainly adequate to reach those goals that we're talking about, unless something really unusual or unexpected happens. So let's look. I got a series of slides here on recent management changes, and they're not just changes. I'm not carefully documenting those, but sort of thinking about what is our management today, how has it changed, and is that recent change suggesting that it's going to have to change some more with some of these aspects? And I'm using everything I could think of pretty well here. Genetic potential, it's been increasing enough, and there's no indication that this is slowing at this point. If yields start to slow down, I don't think it's going to be the genetic aspect of it, but we can't rule that out. Both of those crops have been improved, corn and soybeans, so much that you do always have to wonder, can this continue for another 40 years? Equipment-wise, planting equipment, better vertical and horizontal seed distribution, faster planting, straighter rows, which don't affect yields much, and longer planting delays allowed by GPS and auto steer. Everything is looking up in terms of planting equipment. Application equipment is fast and accurate. Harvest and handling grain, and less header loss, less grain damage, higher capacity, so we can finish early. Most of these have been real positives. Row spacing, I just took an average of the last 4 years. These haven't been changing a huge amount over the last decade or so. Most of these changes took place longer ago than that. But Illinois corn is 3% is reported to be less than 30-inch rows, 96% in 30-inch rows, and 1% greater than 30-inch rows. And Illinois, these are farmer reported numbers, not the survey numbers. Illinois had 70% of soybeans in drilled rows, 62% in 15-inch rows, and 31% in 30-inch rows. Seeding rate has been slowly increasing in corn. Adequate stands now considered to be in the 30,000 to 38,000 range for the most part, unless you're in contests, and we won't pay too much attention to those today. Seeding rate's been slowly decreasing in soybean. I don't have good numbers on that. We consider that stands are generally adequate at 100 to 120,000 plants, or 2.5 to 3 plants per square foot if they're well distributed. Seed quality, due to genetics, better handling, seed treatments, improved emergence, improved plant size uniformity. This has all been a real plus. Are we going to continue to see that improvement? It's hard to say. A lot of stands are pretty close to perfect today, and 30 years ago, we would not have said that. Tile drainage has been a big change, and the amount has increased steadily to now more than 40% of Illinois cropland, according to the 2017 Ag Census. Crop protectants, won't say too much about that, but weeds are changing and herbicides are changing in response. Seeds, soil, genetically modified, foliar insecticides. There's not a huge amount of change now. We don't know what's coming. We can still manage these, and the biggest changes that we're going to see are going to be due to more tolerant pests, especially weeds. Seed and foliar fungicides, I'd say not consistently increasing now, going up and down year by year, but that's pretty much sums that up. And tillage, the equipment continues to evolve, at least the names change, the weight changes, the size changes. Hard to know how much the actual tillage that we're doing is changing. The tillage categories, reduced tillage, et cetera, aren't very descriptive in terms of, well, what did you actually do in this field? It is not clear if soil disturbance is actually decreasing. There is more residue present after tilling corn stalks than there was, say, 20 or 30 years ago, but I'm not sure there's a trend there. We're seeing more soybean stubble tilled, which leaves pretty much bare soil. That's probably not a positive trend in terms of holding soil. I did, from the Census of Agriculture 2012 and 2017, take down what the no-till acreage, just as millions of acres in Illinois, and the percent of farmed acres. And you can see the major change here has been that a big switch from intensive tillage to reduced tillage. That's the big percentage changes. Again, with one person's reduced tillage is maybe another person's intensive tillage. And so these do have a sort of a technical definition, and we'll accept these as they are, but we'll also say that some things that are called reduced tillage are a lot of horsepower and a lot of disturbed soil. Well, this is a busy slide, but I'm talking about irrigation here. In 2012, we added on about 2.2% of the cropland in Illinois, and in 2017, it's about 2.6%. So it's gone up modestly. Many irrigated acres are used for specialty crops. Most of the growth in irrigation in the last few decades has been in the river sands and where we have water to do that. We did a study here at Urbana a few years ago, and for 3 years irrigated corn and irrigated soybean. And you can see what effect we had here. We had irrigation in 13, 14, and 15. 15 was a very wet year, and we saw no advantage to irrigation. On average, over the 3 years, we saw yields moved up by about 12 bushel, or about 5%. You'd say, well, shouldn't they be doing better than 250 bushel if we irrigate them? And I guess that's still an open question a little bit. There must be other things, and maybe it's temperature that's limiting that. Soybean was a little bit more responsive, particularly in that very dry year of 2012, where we got a 12 bushel yield increase and a very high yield, by the way. So the high temperatures that year didn't seem to do the damage. And on average, in 2014 was a very good year. We only had 3 bushel. On average, we got 8 bushel, or about 12% higher yield. So other recent changes, cover crops. Cover crop acreage in Illinois went from 319,000 in 2012 to 708,000, or more than doubled, due to this, according to the Census of Agriculture. Still only on about 3.2% of the cropland. The crop mix in Illinois, it hasn't been changing a huge amount. From 25 to 2009. We had 12.1 million acres of corn and 9.3 of soy. 56.4% was corn of the two crops. And in 2015 to 19, we had 11.2 million acres of corn and 10.3 of soybean. So it was only 52.2% of corn. Of course, the prices came down, and that partly explains why recent years corn acreage has decreased as soybean acreage has increased. We have 1.6 million acres of wheat plus oats plus hay in 2005 to 2009, and by the last 5 years, that was down to 1.1 million. So it's a pretty small crop, and it's not showing many signs of coming back, at least so far. Early planting is certainly favorable, but late planting has less negative effect, and that's my contention here, that with current hybrids, and we saw this in 2019, we're very late planting and still very good yields in many fields. A warmer climate will mean faster and longer seasonal growing degree day accumulation. And I think that means there's more tolerance for late planting. You've basically kind of extended the cropping season when it's warmer like that. And so planting later would have less effect than it might have at one time when late planting meant poor conditions during maturity and dry down, and that's likely to be less the case. So we're talking now about potential on this. Maybe less problem from low temperatures early, and this one's one I put in. We've observed the last few years when corn is planted and it gets low temperatures, and soybean I think as well. In 2020 we saw some of that, where these experience a period of low temperatures after they've emerged, or maybe even before they emerge. We have a hypothesis, at least some of us do, that yield potential might be decreased some. So those people that, are in yield contests and so on, I mean, the high yields that came out of the southeastern US. We didn't see those coming out in 2020, but those are areas where we don't see these daily high temperatures of 50 degrees 2 weeks after and lows in the upper 30s 2 weeks after the crop has emerged. So I'm only guessing here that, and also I'll throw in that our best year that we've ever had in 2018 was the biggest difference between that year and other years was that May was record warm, and it was warm from May 1st through May 31st. I believe daily high temperatures here in Champaign-Urbana were 80 or above every day, but maybe one in May 2018. So I think that, pushing early is good in many ways, but it really helps when the weather stays warm after the crop is in and up. Row spacing, I'll contend, is not a major limitation. I'm not going to show you lots of data on this, but it's not to say that narrowing the rows, corn rows from 30 to 15 or 20, from 30 to 20 might not give you a few bushel, but we don't see a consistent increase in acres of narrow rows in either corn or soybean. And soybean, there's probably been a little bit of reversion from 15s back to 30s by a few people with the larger planters. I'll also contend that the majority of fields get enough nutrients. Deficiencies due to inadequate fertilizer are rare. Higher yields are likely to require in the future modestly more nitrogen. The soil supply is going to remain there. I mean, that's coming from that large amount of organic matter that's there, and that's not going to run out very fast. Or at least we haven't seen it start to run out in 30 or 40 years. But the higher yields with the same supply from the soil means more coming from fertilizer. And higher yields do require more nitrogen. There's little question about that. So that's just looking down the road with arithmetic. If you try to model that, you're not going to find that we're going to be using 50 pounds more nitrogen in 50 years than we are today. This MRTN approach, or the nitrogen rate calculator that many of you are familiar with or should be, includes the ongoing evaluation of end responses. So it's one that sort of has a living database there that we update every off season. And that means that over time, what we get from that should match the needs, if the needs are going to change. And we've seen some of that already with that over the last, 5 or 6 years. These high yields needing high nitrogen rates in Southern Illinois, for example. Today, with the N rate calculator, Southern Illinois calls for more nitrogen than Central or Northern Illinois. And that just goes to show, where the soils have less organic matter and yields are high, fertilizer needed to make up the difference is going to be higher. Seeding rates and good seed quality result in stands high enough to maximize yields in most fields today. It's not that this isn't important, it's just that we've reached a pretty good level already. And just a note here, weather-related stand problems are not fixed by using more seed. And I've seen people sort of talk like, well, maybe we should use a little bit more seed, and if we get some wet conditions and they don't come up very well, then we'll still have enough. It's not very sound thinking. And, using more seed to begin with, in the event that you have to replant it, just means that you spent more money to get the stand that you ended up with. And though tile drainage has been a big contributor to higher yields, obviously one consequence of increased tile drainage is we're shrinking the amount of undrained land. And so, there's not as much to go out there and say, well, this is going to really needs tile and we'll get the big benefit from it. There's still some for sure. And there's a little bit concern that we may be moving into some fields and areas where tile drainage will have less benefit, but that is one feature of it, that when we get up, towards 50% of our fields tile drained, we start to have to look for ones that still need it. Continuing to increase tile density, which is certainly happening in some places, to move more water from fields can limit yields if conditions turn dry. I'm not raising a big red flag here, but we probably have some fields that have more than what the ag engineers might consider the optimum amount of tile. That just means you move more water out of the field, and if it dries out and later in the season and you needed some of that water that went out the tile drain, it's not going to be there. So we'll leave it at that. Tillage changes, I would contend, have not greatly affected yield in recent years. And there's a lot of churning still going on in tillage, and people saying, well, you can strip till and so on. And I'm all in favor of doing things that make the field operations more efficient and that limit the amount of soil disturbance and that we do and maximize the amount of soil cover from the previous crop's residue. So that's, but lack of residue cover can lower water availability in dry periods. And that's one thing that we have to be considering when we think about tilling. And should we set it more aggressively to bury more of the residue so that it's warmer next spring? If it's going to be warmer next spring, due to climate change, we probably are not going to need, that lack of residue is not going to be as helpful. And if we're going to have longer periods of dry weather, and we have seen this in some cases where we've done research where no-till under, seasonally dry conditions can often out-yield tilled. And we have to keep that in mind as well. Even though those, tillage is light and fast, when you're disturbing that surface, you're still losing some and you may be breaking the amount that's moving to the roots. No-till into heavy residue can mean yield decreases. That's true today, and it will continue to be true. But, uh, soybeans can tolerate that pretty well. If we can get a stand with them, we're generally good to go. We do not expect the need for or response to insecticide or fungicide to change consistently. We don't look at spraying, uh, you know, taking the airplane out over every field in 2050 uh, so that we can put on fungicide and insecticide. I just don't think that's going to happen, and I don't think we want to plan for it. Cover crops are not expected to insulate the cash crop from unfavorable soil conditions in the short run. They will and do compete in some cases for nutrients and water. And so our continuing to adopt cover crops is not something, that we should stop doing, but we need to be very careful with it. They can be a threat to the cash crop, and we're just going to have to keep that in mind. Changes in temperature and rainfall patterns and this sort of thing are not going to change that equation. Irrigation could increase some, but recent data that I showed you show only moderate yield increases in productive soil, setting the water supply to non-limiting in these crop models that I showed you earlier. It does not show that it would raise the average yields by enough to pay in most soils. And I guess that comes from the fact that, the rainfall effect is pretty modest for corn and soybeans. And although it's valuable, if we had enough water in every field, our yields would not be 50% higher than they are now, at least not in most years. And there is also realistically not enough water for a lot more irrigation until we decide to tap the Great Lakes or do something like that in 50 years when corn is, at $25 a bushel. What about crop mix and rotation? Illinois is and will remain one of the best places in the world to grow corn and soybeans. That's not going to change. As long as world demand for feed for non-ruminants remains high, these two crops will continue to dominate. That's my prediction in Illinois. Corn and soybean acreage are expected to maybe shift northward to some extent as temperatures warm in the US, but not out of Illinois. Other small acreage crops, organic production, et cetera, will continue as entrepreneurial efforts, and I think I'm all in favor of that to meet market demands. They will likely have little effect on corn and soybean production or acreages, at least in the foreseeable future. We can like new crops and some that they can give us, and some can be high value, but the highest value crops are not going to be growing on 1 million acres all of a sudden in Illinois, because high value means limits on production, not just everybody does this at once and then we'll all make a fortune. The area in which wheat and double crop soybean works may expand northward and offer some potential for increased productivity overall. And I think that's one thing we can watch here in central Illinois. And there's a small caveat I put here. Wheat yield is unlikely to be favored by warmer spring temperatures. Wheat is not a crop that just loves hot and humid weather. But it may survive winters better, and we may be able to harvest it earlier. So the double crop area, especially if then the fall cools off more slowly, we may have some potential there. It's going to be starts and stops as we've seen in recent years. We've had some coming, double crop planted up to Interstate 80 and maybe even beyond when wheat can harvest early, but it's going to take a while before it becomes routine. And a return to livestock production is advocated by some as the way to become more sustainable. And we see this and hear this quite a bit today. But that will require fundamental change in the livestock industry, processing particularly, as well as continued high demand for livestock products and feed. And I guess my question is, a return to sort of a dispersed livestock production likely? Everybody has some cattle and pigs and sheep and so on, or at least a lot of people do. And these are, our prime row crop fields, productive and level, are really good for that. And I don't think a lot of those will become permanent pasture anytime really soon. So let's sum up then. The rest of the 21st century brings expected warming. We expect slightly lower rates of yield increase than current trend lines suggest, but no reversal towards lower yields over time, at least over this century. More variability in days suitable for field work and possibly in planting progress, but a longer season, so possibly less late planting penalty. And possibly more year-to-year variability in yields due to more variable distribution of rainfall. But certainly not, some overhaul in how we manage these crops. I think that our management, tweaked as it will be, is going to continue to serve the needs of the crop, and that's what we really need to consider. Illinois will remain one of the best places to produce current crops, with any large changes in crop mix coming more from market and maybe environmental factors than from climate change. When I say environmental, I'm thinking about, if things really got bad and they said, you can't use nitrogen fertilizer anymore in this county because too much of it ends up in the water, what would that mean? At this point, we don't expect big increases in irrigation or other major changes in productive potential from the soil and weather resources. Might warmer temperatures decrease soil organic matter and so decrease yield potential? That's one question that I've been hearing. My quick answer is not very fast. We, over time, you'd say if temperatures were 5 degrees warmer in Illinois, would soil organic matter be maintained at its current level? And I think it's fair to say probably not, compared to if the temperatures stayed the same or got cooler. But that's the kind of thing that takes a very long time to play out. Will soils stay healthy enough? And I'm just putting it in there as a provocative question. For the short term, at least for now, I would say probably. I guess we'll have to see how that all plays out. What about environmental issues? Well, nutrient loss and soil movement loss are the two major issues. We can address N loss with management. We can't bring it to zero, especially as the number of tile increases. P loss is managed by controlling soil loss mostly, which is by less tillage primarily, and some by application technique. Livestock and manure, they can be managed, I think. The problem is that many people think if everybody just did the right thing, then we wouldn't have a problem anymore. And it probably isn't going to quite work that way. Our last resort, I would say, from an environmental standpoint, is to plant our acres to perennial crops, either forages or prairie or some kind of planting. And by doing that and limiting any application of fertilizer, especially nitrogen, well, we can nearly eliminate nutrient loss by that technique. I think it would require some sort of buyout or much enlarged CRP program. And it's more likely in more marginal areas, and that's not, for the most part, Illinois. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you gained a little bit from that.